Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we are going to study Chapter 1, Lesson 2, Classifying Life. First of all, let us ask a question. Why do biologists classify organisms? Why it's so important to classify organisms? So far, scientists have identified more than 1 million kinds of organisms on Earth. That's a large number, of course, and it keeps growing as scientists discover new organisms. So, it would be a lot easier if similar organisms were placed into groups. Organizing living things into groups is exactly what biologists have done. Biologists group organisms based on similarities. So, let us define the word classification. Classification is the process of grouping things based on their similarities. Biologists use classification to organize living things into groups so that the organisms are easier to study. The scientific study of how organisms are classified is called taxonomy. Taxonomy is useful because once an organism is classified, a scientist knows a lot of information about that organism. Taxonomy also involves naming organisms. A scientist called Carlos Linnaeus devised a system of naming organisms that is still used today. Linnaeus placed organisms in groups based on their observable features. Each organism was given a unique two-part scientific name. The system is called binomial nomenclature. Now let us define the scientific terms genus and species. A genus is a classification grouping that contains similar, closely related organisms. But a species is a group of similar organisms that can mate with each other and produce offspring that can also mate and reproduce. Binomial nomenclature system is so important because it makes it easy for scientists to communicate about one organism, because everyone uses the same scientific name for the same organism. Let us learn now about the major levels of classification. Of course, organisms are not grouped by where they live, but by their shared characteristics. Most biologists today classify organisms into levels. First, an organism is placed into a broad group, which in turn is divided into more specific groups. As you can see in front of you, a domain is the broadest level of organization. Within a domain, there are kingdoms. Within kingdoms, there are phyla. Within phyla are classes. Within classes are orders. Within orders are families. Each family contains one or more genera. Finally, each genus contains one or more species. The more classification levels two organisms share, the more characteristics they have in common and the more closely related they are. After learning the levels of classification, let us learn how can we identify different organisms. You could use a field guide. Field guides are books with illustrations that highlight differences between similar looking organisms. You could also use a taxonomic key. Taxonomic keys are useful tools that help determine the identity of organisms. By the end of this lesson, you already know why do biologists classify organisms, what are the levels of classification, and how are taxonomic keys useful. I hope that you understand the lesson. See you soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.